Welcome to English Never Give Up podcast. Millions of people have spent years, actual years, memorizing grammar rules, filling out worksheets, and sitting through classes, and they still freeze up the moment someone says hello to them in English. Today, we are breaking down why that happens, what absolute beginners should actually do first to start learning English fast, and how to go from knowing almost nothing to holding a real conversation sooner than you'd expect. By the end of this episode, you'll understand the core methods that work, the mistakes that waste your time, and exactly where to start. I've got someone here who has thought deeply about this, so let's get into it. What is the single biggest misconception people have when they start learning English?
The biggest misconception is that learning English means studying English. Those are two completely different things. Studying is memorizing vocabulary lists, drilling grammar rules, doing exercises in a textbook. Learning, real learning, is about using the language, hearing it, feeling it, making mistakes with it. Most beginners spend almost all their time studying and almost no time actually using English. And then they wonder why they can't speak.
Okay, so what does using English actually look like for someone who is a total beginner? Like someone who knows maybe 10 words?
So there's this concept called comprehensible input, and it's really the foundation of fast language learning. The idea is simple. You need to be exposed to English that you can mostly understand, maybe 80 to 90% of it, with just a little bit that's new or challenging. Not too easy, not too hard. Your brain is wired to pick up language patterns when it's getting input it can mostly follow.
Comprehensible input. I like that. So it's not just throwing yourself into a room full of native speakers and hoping for the best.
Exactly, and that's actually a really common mistake. People think immersion means total confusion, and that's not how it works. If you understand nothing, your brain just shuts down. You need that sweet spot where you're challenged but not lost. For absolute beginners, that means things like slow English podcasts made specifically for learners, graded readers, which are books written with simple vocabulary, or even children's shows in English.
Wait, children's shows? Like, actually?
100%. The vocabulary is simple, the sentences are short, the situations are easy to follow visually. You're not just hearing words, you're seeing context. And context is everything when you're a beginner. Your brain is connecting sounds to meaning, and visual context makes that connection so much faster.
This actually reminds me, there's this funny thing where Peppa Pig, the cartoon, became genuinely famous among adult English learners, especially in China. People were posting about how they'd watch it to practice, and it kind of became a meme, but also a real learning strategy at the same time.
And that's not a joke at all, that's actually smart. The reason it works is because the language is predictable, the episodes are short, and you can watch the same one multiple times without getting bored. Repetition is huge for beginners. Every time you hear a word or phrase in context, your brain is reinforcing that connection.
So repetition is key. What about vocabulary? Because I feel like a lot of beginners get overwhelmed. There are so many words in English.
Here's the thing that surprises most people. You don't need that many words to have a real conversation. Research on language learning suggests that knowing the most common 1,000 words in English covers something like 80% of everyday spoken language. So if you focus on the most frequent, most useful words first, you can get functional really quickly. You don't need to know every word. You need to know the right words.
That's actually kind of reassuring. So it's not about knowing everything, it's about knowing what matters most.
Exactly. And the way you learn those words matters too. There's a method called spaced repetition where you review words at increasing intervals. So you see a new word today, then tomorrow, then in 3 days, then a week later. Apps like Anki or Duolingo use versions of this. Your brain remembers things better when it has to work a little to recall them, and spacing out the reviews does exactly that.
Okay, so we've got comprehensible input, we've got spaced repetition for vocabulary, but here's what I want to push back on a little. You mentioned speaking early, and I think for a lot of beginners, that's terrifying. Like the idea of opening your mouth and saying something wrong in front of another person is genuinely scary.
It is scary, and I want to acknowledge that because it's real. But here's what the research on language acquisition actually shows. Making mistakes is not a sign that you're failing. It's literally how your brain learns. When you say something wrong and get corrected, or when you notice the gap between what you said and what you meant, your brain flags that and works to fix it. That process is essential. You cannot shortcut it.
So the embarrassment is actually part of the process.
It is. And the people who make the fastest progress are almost always the ones who are willing to sound bad early. They're not waiting until they feel ready, because that feeling of readiness never really comes if you're only studying. You get ready by doing, speaking from day one, even if it's just simple phrases, even if your pronunciation is off. That's what builds the neural pathways for the language.
That's a really different mindset from what most people are taught. Most language classes kind of reward you for getting things right, not for trying and failing.
Right, and that's a structural problem with a lot of traditional language education. The classroom environment can actually make people more afraid of mistakes, not less. When you're graded on accuracy, you start to avoid risk. But language learning requires risk. You have to be willing to put something out there that might be wrong.
So, what does speaking practice actually look like for someone who is truly at the beginning? Like, who do you even speak to?
There are more options now than ever before. Language exchange apps connect you with native English speakers who want to learn your language, so you both help each other. There are also online tutors who specialize in beginners and are trained to be patient and encouraging. And honestly, even talking to yourself, narrating what you're doing, describing what you see, is a legitimate practice method. It sounds silly, but it works.
Talking to yourself. I love that. Very low stakes.
Extremely low stakes. And it forces you to actually produce language, which is different from just recognizing it. There's a big gap between understanding a word when you hear it and being able to use it yourself. Speaking practice, even alone, helps close that gap.
Let's talk about something I find really interesting, the role of content you actually enjoy. Because I think there's this idea that learning has to feel like work, like you have to sit down with a textbook and suffer through it.
That idea is one of the biggest barriers to progress. When you're emotionally engaged with content, when you actually care about what's happening, your brain is in a completely different state than when you're grinding through exercises you find boring. Emotional engagement improves memory and attention. So if you love cooking, watch English cooking videos. If you love sports, listen to English sports commentary. The language learning happens almost as a side effect.
That's such a good point. It's like your brain doesn't even realize it's studying.
Exactly. And that's actually the ideal state for language acquisition. When you're focused on the meaning, on what's being said, rather than on the language itself, you're absorbing patterns naturally. It's the same way children learn their first language. They're not thinking about grammar, they're thinking about what they want to say.
Speaking of children, I want to bring up something that comes up a lot, which is this idea that kids learn languages faster than adults. Is that actually true?
It's more complicated than people think. Children do have some advantages. They're not self conscious, they're not afraid of mistakes, and they have enormous amounts of time for exposure. But adults actually have real cognitive advantages too. Adults are better at pattern recognition, they can use their existing knowledge to make connections, and they're more motivated in a focused way. Adults who use the right methods can make very fast progress.
So the kids are better at languages thing is kind of a myth, or at least an oversimplification.
It's an oversimplification, yes. The real advantage children have is time and fearlessness, not some magical biological ability. Adults who approach language learning with the same fearlessness, who are willing to sound like a child, to make basic mistakes, to ask simple questions, can learn just as fast, sometimes faster.
I want to come back to something you mentioned earlier, podcasts for learners, because I think that's actually a really underrated tool. Can you talk more about how passive listening fits into all of this?
Passive listening is genuinely powerful, especially for building what people call an ear for the language. When you listen to English regularly, even while you're doing something else, like cooking or commuting, you're training your brain to recognize the sounds, the rhythms, the patterns of English. You're not consciously studying, but something is happening. Your brain is getting familiar with how the language sounds.
So it's not just background noise, something is actually being processed.
Right. And the key is that it should be comprehensible. You should be able to follow at least some of it. Pure noise doesn't help, but a slow English podcast where you catch maybe 60 or 70%, that's your brain working. And over time, that percentage goes up. You start catching more and more without even trying.
That's actually kind of amazing when you think about it. You're learning while you live your life.
And that's the goal, really. The most successful language learners are the ones who find ways to weave English into their daily life, not just into a dedicated study session. Every moment of exposure counts. Every English song you listen to, every English caption you read, every English video you watch, it all adds up.
Let's talk about pronunciation for a second, because I think that's another thing that trips up beginners. English spelling and pronunciation are notoriously inconsistent.
Oh, English spelling is genuinely chaotic. The word through and though and thought, they all look similar but sound completely different. For beginners, the advice I'd give is don't try to learn pronunciation from reading, learn it from listening. Mimic what you hear. Repeat phrases out loud after native speakers. Your mouth needs to practice making these sounds, and the only way to do that is to actually make them.
Mimicking. So almost like an actor learning a role.
That's actually a great analogy. Actors who learn accents do exactly this. They listen obsessively, they repeat, they exaggerate the sounds until they feel natural. Beginners can do the same thing. Pick a speaker you like, someone whose English you enjoy listening to, and try to copy how they sound. It's called shadowing, and it's one of the most effective pronunciation techniques out there.
Shadowing. I've heard that term before, but never really understood what it meant. So you're literally speaking at the same time as the person you're listening to?
Exactly. You listen to a sentence and you repeat it immediately, trying to match the rhythm, the stress, the intonation. You're not just copying the words, you're copying the music of the language. English has a very specific rhythm. Certain syllables are stressed, others are reduced, and shadowing helps you internalize that rhythm in a way that reading never can.
The music of the language. I really like that framing. It makes it feel less like a chore and more like something you can actually enjoy.
And that shift in mindset is huge. When you start thinking of English as something you're exploring rather than something you're conquering, the whole experience changes. You become curious instead of anxious. And curiosity is one of the best states for learning.
Let me ask you about something practical. How much time should a beginner actually be spending on English every day? Because I think people either go too hard and burn out, or they do too little and don't make progress.
Consistency beats intensity every time. 30 minutes every day will get you further than 3 hours on a Saturday. Your brain needs regular exposure to build and reinforce those language pathways. So the goal isn't to find a huge block of time, it's to find small pockets throughout your day. 10 minutes of listening in the morning, 10 minutes of vocabulary review at lunch, 10 minutes of speaking practice in the evening. That's already a solid routine.
30 minutes a day. That feels actually doable, not overwhelming.
That's the point. The best learning routine is the one you actually stick to. And if 30 minutes feels like too much at the start, even 15 is fine. The key is showing up every day. Language learning is a long game, and the people who win it are the ones who keep going, not the ones who sprint and then stop.
I want to bring up something that I think is really relevant for absolute beginners specifically, the question of which English to learn. Because there's British English, American English, Australian English, and they all sound pretty different.
For absolute beginners, this is honestly not something to stress about. Pick one variety and stick with it, at least at the start. Most learning materials are either American or British English, so just go with whichever you have the most access to, or whichever you find most useful for your goals. Once you have a solid foundation, understanding different accents becomes much easier.
So don't overthink it, just pick one and go.
Exactly. Overthinking is actually one of the biggest traps for beginners. They spend so much time researching the best method, the best app, the best textbook, that they never actually start. Any decent method done consistently will get you results. The starting is the hard part.
That's such a real thing. Analysis paralysis. You're so busy trying to find the perfect approach that you never take the first step.
And the first step is always the same. Start listening. Before you worry about grammar, before you worry about writing, before you worry about anything else, just start getting your ears used to English. That's the foundation everything else is built on.
Let's talk about writing for a second, because I think a lot of beginners feel like they need to master speaking before they can write, or vice versa. Is there an order that makes sense?
For absolute beginners, I'd say the priority order is listening, then speaking, then reading, then writing. That mirrors how we naturally acquire our first language. We hear before we speak before we read before we write. Writing is actually the most complex skill because it requires you to produce language without any of the real-time cues you get in conversation. So it comes last, but it's still important.
That makes a lot of sense. It's almost like building a house. You need the foundation before you put up the walls.
That's exactly it. And a lot of traditional language education gets this backwards. They start with reading and writing, which are the most abstract skills, and then wonder why students struggle to speak. The natural order is the right order.
Okay, I want to ask about something that I think is really specific to English, idioms and slang, because even if you learn proper English, native speakers use so much informal language that it can feel like a completely different language.
This is real, and it's something beginners should know about but not panic about. Idioms and slang are important for understanding natural English, but they're not where you start. You start with core vocabulary and basic sentence structures. Once you have that foundation, idioms start to make sense in context. You'll hear them, you'll see them used, and gradually they'll click. Trying to memorize idioms before you have the basics is like trying to decorate a house before you've built the walls.
Back to the house analogy. I like it. So idioms come naturally once you have the foundation.
They do. And honestly, the best way to learn idioms is through exposure, through listening and reading real English content. When you hear an idiom in context, in a show or a podcast, your brain has so much more to work with than if you just read a definition in a list. Context is everything.
Context is everything. That keeps coming back. It really does seem like the through line of everything we've talked about today.
It really is. Language doesn't exist in isolation. Words mean things because of the situations they're used in, the tone they're said with, the relationship between the speakers. The more context you have, the faster and deeper your understanding becomes. That's why real content, real conversations, real shows, real podcasts is so much more powerful than artificial textbook exercises.
So, when you step back from everything we've covered today, what does the picture actually look like for an absolute beginner who wants to learn English fast?
Here's what it really comes down to. You start with listening, comprehensible input, content you can mostly follow, content you actually enjoy. You build your core vocabulary using spaced repetition, focusing on the most common and useful words first. You start speaking early, even when it's scary, even when it's imperfect, because that's how your brain learns. You find ways to weave English into your daily life so it's not just a study session, but a living part of your day. And you stay consistent. 30 minutes every day beats 3 hours once a week, every single time.
And the mindset piece, the willingness to sound bad, to make mistakes, to be a beginner, that's not just nice to have. That's actually essential.
It's the most essential thing. Every fluent English speaker you've ever admired went through a stage where they sounded exactly like you do right now. The difference between the people who got fluent and the people who didn't isn't talent or intelligence, it's willingness to keep going through the uncomfortable early stages. That's it. That's the whole secret.
I love that. And it connects back to something you said at the very beginning. The people who make the fastest progress are the ones willing to sound bad early. That's not a weakness, that's actually the strategy.
Exactly. Sounding bad early is the price of sounding good later. And the sooner you pay that price, the sooner you get to the good part.
So here's what I want to leave you with. We started this episode talking about people who spend years studying English and still can't hold a conversation. Now, you know why that happens. They were studying, not learning. They were waiting to feel ready instead of speaking. They were grinding through grammar instead of listening to content they love.
And the beautiful thing is that none of this requires expensive courses or perfect conditions. You need a phone, an internet connection, and the willingness to start today. The tools are all there. The method is clear. The only thing standing between you and English is the decision to begin.
The decision to begin. That's it. So here's your action step. Today, not tomorrow, find one piece of English content you actually enjoy. A show, a podcast, a song, a YouTube channel. Something that makes you curious. And just listen. Don't worry about understanding everything. Don't worry about grammar. Just listen. That's your first step, and it's the most important one you'll take.
And if you catch yourself thinking, I'll start when I know more, that's the trap. You learn more by starting every single time.
Years of worksheets, 0 conversations, or 30 minutes a day of content you love, and a real conversation sooner than you think. The choice is pretty clear. Thanks for listening to English Never Give Up podcasts.